The lights of NBC's studio at Rockefeller Center shone with calculated intensity, illuminating the set of The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon as the audience buzzed with anticipation. The Roots had just wrapped up a jazzy rendition of the Space Jam theme, and the murmur in the room swelled as the host bounced toward his desk, adjusting his immaculate navy blue suit. It was a typical Thursday night in New York, cold enough to justify the winter coats hanging on the backs of audience chairs, but not as cold as January in Chicago, thought Michael Jordan as he waited backstage. He gently massaged his right knee, a habit formed after years of wear and tear on NBA courts. Even at 62, Jordan's posture radiated the same unwavering confidence that had defined him for decades. "Your next guest is simply a living legend," announced Jimmy Fallon with his signature youthful enthusiasm, his voice rising above the growing applause. "Six-time NBA champion, six-time Finals MVP, owner of the Charlotte Hornets, billionaire, and the man who made me believe I could fly when I was a kid, until I realized expensive sneakers don't replace talent. Please welcome Michael Jordan." The roar of the crowd was deafening as Jordan emerged, crossing the stage with that distinctive, confident walk that had been mimicked by millions. He wore a charcoal gray tailored suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, with a pristine white shirt and a subtle red tie, the colors of the Chicago Bulls, a quiet homage to the franchise that had turned him into an icon. His signature smile lit up his face as he greeted Fallon with a warm hug and waved to the standing crowd that applauded frantically. Questlove, drummer of the Roots and a well-known Bulls fan, played a drum riff that made Jordan point approvingly at the band. "Welcome! Welcome!" exclaimed Fallon, motioning for Jordan to take a seat in the guest chair. "Man, every time you show up, I feel like we should be charging extra admission. It's an honor to have you here." "It's good to be back, Jimmy," Jordan replied in that deep, melodious voice, comfortably crossing his legs. "Last time I was here, you challenged me to a mini golf match, and you still owe me $20. The conversation flowed naturally as Fallon moved through the usual topics: the latest Air Jordan line, the Hornets' current performance, new business ventures, and family life. Jordan responded with that familiar mix of candor and charm that made him as magnetic off the court as he was on it. In the audience, a mix of generations watched in admiration. Adults who had idolized his feats in the 90s, alongside teenagers who knew him more as a meme or logo than as the transcendent athlete who revolutionized global sports. The studio's soft lighting highlighted the expression lines on Jordan's face, marks of a life lived intensely under the brightest spotlights in sports. His eyes, however, still held that piercing intensity that had terrified opponents for 2 decades on the hardwood. "So, what's it like when kids come up to you nowadays and ask, 'Are you the sneaker guy?' instead of knowing about your 6 finals?" Fallon asked, leaning forward with genuine amusement. "It's funny because now it's the parents who get nervous when they see me," Jordan replied with a deep laugh that echoed through the studio. "The kids don't get why Dad's about to faint, while they just want to know if I've met LeBron." The audience erupted in laughter, and even Fallon needed a moment to recover. The host then picked up a basketball placed on a small stand beside his desk, a regulation NBA Wilson ball with the Bulls logo discreetly visible. It was part of the show's routine. Celebrities signed items for charity giveaways. Fallon explained that the ball would be auctioned for Jordan's foundation, with proceeds going to youth sports programs in underserved communities in Chicago and Charlotte. It was a light moment, a predictable segment, the kind that would normally pass without incident on the tightly scheduled late-night show. "Let's do this, Michael. This ball is going to help a lot of kids," Fallon said, reaching for a special gold pen designed for autographs on basketball leather. "Maybe a few future Jordans are out there waiting for their chance because of this." "Always happy to help the next generation," Jordan replied, reaching out to take the pen. "Although I tell my wife I've signed so many balls, my autograph's probably worth less than an Applebee's coupon these days." It was at that moment, when the camera zoomed in on the side table where the ball was positioned, that Jordan saw the object. Almost hidden behind the base of the ball was a small wooden cross, seemingly insignificant to any casual observer. It was a simple item, maybe 6 inches tall, made of dark polished wood, unadorned and with no visible engravings. The kind of thing you might find in any religious goods store in Manhattan. For viewers at home and most of the studio audience, it was just a random prop, possibly left over from an earlier segment or placed there accidentally by a crew member. But for Michael Jordan, that small symbol triggered a visceral, immediate reaction captured in high definition. The change was immediate and dramatic. Jordan's easy smile vanished, replaced by an expression that blended shock, recognition, and something approaching fear. An expression rarely seen on a man known for his unshakable composure, even under the most intense pressure. His body, once relaxed in the chair, visibly tensed. The hand reaching for the pen froze midair, suspended in time. His eyes, usually sharp and confident, widened slightly, locked on that small wooden object as if he were seeing a ghost materialize before him. It was a moment so raw, so unexpected, that not even NBC's best video editors could have scripted it. Michael Jordan, perhaps the most composed and mentally resilient athlete in modern history, visibly shaken by a simple wooden cross. I'm sorry, murmured Jordan, clearing his throat and trying to regain his composure. His fingers now trembled slightly. Another phenomenon never before associated with the man whose hands had been steady enough to hit the championship-winning shot in the sixth finals with the entire Madison Square Garden rooting against him. "You okay, Michael?" asked Fallon, his expression shifting quickly from entertained to genuinely concerned. The host leaned forward, momentarily forgetting the cameras and audience. A seasoned professional, he could recognize when something unscripted was unfolding on his show. But Jordan's reaction seemed beyond any ordinary improvisation. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity in the fast pace of live television, the studio sank into an uncomfortable silence. Producers backstage began frantically communicating through their earpieces, unsure whether to cut to a commercial break. The audience, sensing the palpable shift in atmosphere, collectively held their breath. The Roots Band, always attuned to the show's dynamics, subtly faded their background music into silence. The camera director, realizing something significant was happening, zoomed in on Jordan's face, capturing every nuance of his transformed expression. "Michael?" Fallon repeated, lowering his voice to a gentler, more personal tone, momentarily shedding his host persona. "Do we need a break?" Jordan seemed not to hear Fallon's question for a few seconds, his gaze still fixed on the cross. Then, with a deliberate motion that seemed to carry the weight of a monumental decision, he reached out and took the small wooden object. His long fingers, the same ones that had handled a basketball with supernatural finesse, now held the cross with an unusual reverence for a man who rarely displayed vulnerability in public. He turned the object in his hands, examining it as if confirming something to himself. The camera captured the moment his thumb gently stroked the base of the cross, where a small mark or inscription seemed to exist, invisible to everyone except him. "Forgive me, Jimmy," Jordan finally said, his voice regaining part of its usual strength, though now laced with a new quality, something darker, more reflective. "I didn't expect to see this here today." "What is it?" Fallon asked, genuinely curious, trying to steer back to safer conversational waters while respecting the clear emotional impact the object had on his guest. "Does it have special meaning?" Jordan looked directly at Fallon, then at the main camera, and finally at the silent audience. It was the same look he gave moments before making a decisive move in a major game. Calculating, measuring, deciding. Millions of viewers at home, who had tuned in expecting lighthearted stories and laughter, were now captivated by this unexpected moment of raw authenticity in the middle of a late-night entertainment show. The New York studio, normally vibrant with laughter and energy, was suspended in a respectful silence rarely experienced on live television. "This cross," Jordan began, his voice now firm but charged with a restrained emotion that made everyone in the studio unconsciously lean forward. He paused, clearly weighing his next words with the same care he approached every meticulously controlled aspect of his public life. Fallon, a veteran of countless interviews, knew enough to remain silent, giving his guest the space he needed to process whatever was happening. "This cross," Jordan continued after a moment, "is identical to the one he gave me that night in Rome." The words hung in the studio air like a bombshell revelation in a carefully scripted drama. There was no need to clarify who Jordan referred to, as the context and nature of the object made it implicit. That night in Rome, words laden with untold history, hinting at an encounter that had clearly never been shared with the public. In 7 simple words, Michael Jordan had introduced a mystery that instantly captured the imagination of everyone present. The man the world thought they knew so well after decades under public scrutiny had just suggested that an entire chapter of his life had remained completely hidden, until now. Fallon, experiencing rare seconds of genuine awe, looked at his producers backstage, who were frantically signaling for him to follow this unexpected line of conversation. The host adjusted his tie, a nervous habit that emerged only in rare moments when events transcended the show's carefully planned script. The band remained in respectful silence, and even the usually effusive audience seemed to collectively hold its breath. "Michael," Fallon finally said, leaning forward with genuine interest that went beyond his role as an entertainer. "Are you talking about who I think you're talking about? And if so, I think we'd all very much like to hear about this night in Rome that you've never mentioned before." Jordan nodded slowly, still holding the cross with almost tangible reverence. For a brief moment, the man who had controlled his public image with the same precision he controlled the ball on the court seemed to be waging an internal battle about how much to reveal. Then, as he always had in the crucial moments of his career, Michael Jordan made a decision. He looked directly into the main camera, as if establishing a direct connection with the millions of viewers now watching with renewed attention, and nodded once, decisively. "Yes, Jimmy," he replied, his voice now carrying a quality few had ever heard before, the voice of a man about to share something precious, kept hidden for years. "I'm talking about Pope Francis, and I think maybe it's time I tell the world about our meeting and what he asked me to do." An absolute silence blanketed the Tonight Show studio like a thick fog, the kind of silence that rarely surfaces in entertainment programs where laughter and applause are practically currency. Even during the most emotional recordings, producers typically guide the audience on how to react. But this time, no guidance was needed. 230 people breathed in unison, as if an unspoken agreement had been made not to disturb the moment. Jimmy Fallon, usually energetic and always ready with a joke to ease tension, remained motionless in his chair, fingers interlocked on the desk, his expression reflecting a mixture of reverence and journalistic curiosity he rarely had the chance to express. The mere mention of Pope Francis had instantly turned a relaxed talk show into something more akin to a historical testimony. The camera director, sensing the weight of the moment, maintained a wide shot that captured both Jordan and Fallon, with occasional cuts to the attentive faces in the audience. Even the technicians and producers backstage, normally busy with their monitors and headsets, paused to watch, feeling they were about to witness something extraordinary. "It was exactly 3 years ago," Jordan began, his voice now softer and more contemplative, contrasting with the confident tone he had maintained throughout his public life. "I was in Milan for the opening of a new Air Jordan store. Yvette, my wife, had stayed in Charlotte to take care of some foundation matters. I remember being in the Four Seasons lobby, ready to have dinner with a few Nike executives, when a man quietly approached. 'Michael Jordan meeting a fan? That must happen every 5 minutes of your life,' Fallon quipped, trying to slightly lighten the tension, though keeping a respectful tone that acknowledged the seriousness of the story he was about to hear. "This wasn't your typical fan, Jimmy," Jordan replied, a faint smile briefly appearing on his lips before vanishing. "He was dressed in civilian clothes, a simple black suit, nothing flashy. He could have easily passed for a bank executive or a lawyer, but there was something about his posture, the way he approached. After decades of being approached by strangers, you develop a sixth sense. This man wasn't after an autograph." The silence endured as Jordan shifted in his seat, placing a small cross on the table beside the still unsigned basketball. The cross suddenly seemed disproportionately important. No longer a trivial decorative object, but the trigger to a story no one in the studio had anticipated. The camera zoomed in for a close-up of the object, its dark wood standing out against the light-colored table. Jordan took a deep breath, as if gathering his memories, organizing them mentally before sharing them with millions. His eyes, always intense, appeared focused on something distant. Not the studio, but the streets of Milan 3 years ago. The man introduced himself as Monsignor Vincenzo Rossi, a personal assistant to His Holiness. He spoke English with a soft Italian accent, but was perfectly clear. I admit my first reaction was skepticism. When you're a public figure, you get all kinds of strange approaches. But then he handed me an envelope with the official papal seal and a small card with a phone number. His Holiness would like to invite you to a private audience in Rome tomorrow night, he said. This matter requires utmost discretion. Please come alone and call this number upon arrival in Rome for further instructions. And then, as discreetly as he had appeared, he vanished. Wow, murmured Fallon, completely absorbed in the story, momentarily forgetting his role as conversation facilitator. And you just canceled everything and went? Considering everything I'd already accomplished in life and the people I'd met, you'd think an invitation like that wouldn't shake me, Jordan reflected, his large, expressive hands moving gently as he spoke. Presidents, kings, some of the biggest celebrities and historical figures of our time. But a personal invitation from the Pope? That was different. I called my assistant and rearranged the entire next day's schedule. Told him it was an urgent family matter. It was the first time in years I'd lied to my team. The mention of a lie, a rare admission of imperfection from a man whose public actions had always been meticulously measured, caused a barely perceptible murmur in the audience. Sensing the reaction, Jordan slightly raised his hand in a gesture that seemed to ask for both understanding and patience. The studio fell into absolute silence again. Fallon leaned forward, completely still, his eyes never leaving Jordan's face. The story was unfolding in real time, unscripted, unrehearsed. The purest form of live television, rare even among the most prestigious programs. The next morning I took a private jet to Rome, thankfully avoiding media attention. I stayed in a discreet suite at the Hotel Hassler near the Spanish Steps. The decor was elegant, with ceiling frescoes and a view of the Roman rooftops straight out of a Fellini film, but I barely registered those details. My mind was consumed with trying to imagine why Pope Francis wanted to see me with such urgency and secrecy. At 7 p.m., as instructed, I called the number Monsignor had given me. A different voice answered, younger, also with an Italian accent. A car will be waiting for you at the hotel's side entrance in 15 minutes, the voice said. Please come alone and do not inform the front desk of your departure. This sounds like something out of a spy movie, Fallon remarked, his tone balanced between fascination and respectful disbelief. Weren't you, I don't know, concerned it might be some kind of elaborate trap? I considered that possibility, Jimmy, Jordan replied with a slight nod. I've spent my whole life assessing risk, on the court, in business, but something about the situation felt genuine. The envelope had the official Vatican seal, not something easily faked. And honestly, who would go through such elaborate measures? What would they stand to gain? Even so, I sent a coded message to my head of security. If he didn't hear from me by midnight, he was to contact certain people. Basic precaution. Jordan's words, measured and precise like his famous mid-range jump shots, kept both the audience and the viewers at home completely captivated by the narrative. The story had now transformed into something worthy of the finest Hollywood productions, except this wasn't fiction. It was a first-hand account from one of the most famous and private athletes in the world about a secret meeting with one of the most influential religious figures in modern history. The show's cut director, recognizing the historical significance of the moment, had abandoned the usual fast-paced edits, allowing the camera to remain focused on Jordan for extended periods, capturing every nuance of his expression as he recounted this extraordinary story. Exactly at 7:15 p.m., I slipped quietly out of the hotel's side entrance. A black Fiat, nothing flashy, was parked by the curb. The driver, whose name I never learned, opened the rear door without saying a word. In the back seat sat the same Monsignor who had approached me in Milan. Mr. Jordan, he said, thank you for your discretion. His Holiness is eager to meet you. On the way, he explained that we would be entering the Vatican through an access point rarely used, reserved for visits requiring the utmost privacy. We rode through the streets of Rome in silence afterward, passing tourists, snapping pictures of the lit-up Colosseum, couples walking hand in hand through historic squares, families enjoying gelato at outdoor tables. none of them imagining that Michael Jordan was on his way to a secret meeting with the Pope. The car took us down increasingly narrow streets until we reached an inconspicuous gate at the back of the Vatican. Not the main entrance known to tourists, nor even one of the secondary ones used by dignitaries. It was almost invisible, integrated into the centuries-old wall. A Swiss guard, dressed in civilian clothes rather than the famous colorful uniform, quickly checked our identity and let us in. I remember thinking how surreal it was. Me, a kid who grew up in housing projects in North Carolina, now entering the heart of the Catholic Church for a private meeting with the spiritual leader of over 1 billion people. It was like entering another world, Jordan continued, his eyes briefly closing as if to better visualize the scene he described. Marble hallways, Renaissance frescoes, statues that had witnessed centuries of history, all illuminated only by soft lights, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the ancient walls. The Monsignor led me through a series of passages, some so narrow we could barely walk side by side. "These are little-known routes," he whispered, "used for centuries when the Pope must meet someone away from the public eye." I thought about how many secrets those walls held, how many historic meetings had taken place far from the world's gaze. Can you imagine what was going through my mind at that moment, Jimmy? I, who had always controlled every aspect of my public life, was now completely out of my element, following a stranger through dark corridors in the heart of the Vatican. No cameras, no bodyguards, no agents or assistants, just me heading into the unknown. "I can't imagine it," Fallon responded, his voice nearly a whisper, abandoning his usual cheerful host persona. "Most of us will never experience anything remotely like that." After several minutes walking through that labyrinth, we arrived at a simple wooden door. No ornamentation, nothing to suggest the importance of what lay beyond. The Monsignor stopped, turned to me and said, "His Holiness awaits you alone in the garden. He specifically requested no security presence. Please enter when you're ready." And then, with a slight nod, he walked away, leaving me alone before that unmarked door. Jordan paused, seemingly reliving the moment. The audience and Fallon remained in reverent silence. No technician dared adjust anything. No producer backstage dared suggest a commercial break. The moment transcended normal television programming considerations. Jordan raised the small wooden cross again, holding it as if its weight went beyond its physical dimensions. "I hesitated for a moment before opening that door," he continued, his voice now softer. "In my career, I faced the most critical moments with absolute confidence. Game-winning shots with seconds on the clock, million-dollar negotiations, interviews with the global press. But at that moment, I felt something I rarely experience: genuine uncertainty. What could a man like Pope Francis possibly want with me? Why such secrecy, such discretion?" I took a deep breath, turned the doorknob, and stepped inside. The studio remained silent as Jordan described the scene he encountered beyond that mysterious door. His words painted a vivid picture that everyone present could visualize: a small inner garden, hidden within the Vatican walls, lit only by a few strategically placed lanterns. The Roman night air carried the scent of jasmine and ancient herbs. Weather-worn stone benches encircled a small fountain, whose gentle trickle created an almost meditative atmosphere. And there, sitting alone on one of the benches, dressed in a simple white cassock without any of the formal adornments of his office, was Pope Francis. He was completely alone, Jordan emphasized, his tone revealing that this detail still impressed him years later. No security, no assistants, no photographers or advisors, just an elderly man in a garden, waiting. When I entered, he looked up from a small book he was reading and smiled. It wasn't the diplomatic smile you see in official photos, but something more genuine, more personal. "Michael," he said in English with a strong Argentinian accent, "thank you for coming. Please sit with me. Not Mr. Jordan, not champion, just Michael, as if we were old friends meeting for a casual conversation." "And it was at that moment, Jimmy," Jordan went on, leaning slightly forward in his chair, drawing even more attention from everyone in the studio, "that I realized something fundamental about that meeting, something Pope Francis made clear with his first words and his behavior. He hadn't invited Michael Jordan, the basketball icon, the billionaire entrepreneur, the global legend. He wanted to meet Michael Jordan, the man. The final words lingered in the studio air like a profound revelation. Jimmy Fallon, usually loquacious and always ready with a joke or comment, remained silent, instinctively recognizing that any intervention at that moment would be inappropriate. The audience, equally quiet, seemed to collectively hold their breath. The cameras captured Jordan's face, not the mask of unshakable confidence the world knew, but a more vulnerable and authentic expression, revealing layers of a man few had truly seen beyond the public persona carefully cultivated for decades. In that moment, in the Tonight Show studio, Michael Jordan wasn't just revealing a secret meeting with the Pope. He was, perhaps for the first time, allowing the world a glimpse of the man beyond the legend. Jimmy Fallon adjusted in his chair, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just heard. The studio lights seemed to dim on their own, creating an almost confessional atmosphere. For a moment, the host seemed undecided between maintaining a respectful silence or steering the narrative forward. He opted for the latter, leaning slightly forward with a genuine curiosity that transcended his professional role. "Michael, I'm honestly at a loss for words," Fallon confessed, his voice noticeably softer than his usual tone. "You just told us you secretly met with Pope Francis in a private garden within the Vatican. If it weren't you telling this, I'd swear we were filming a scene from a Dan Brown thriller. What happened in that meeting? What did Pope Francis want to discuss with you that required such secrecy?" "That's a fair question," Jordan responded, shifting in his chair as his fingers still gently traced the small wooden cross. "I spent the first few minutes in that garden wondering the same thing. The initial silence was comfortable, if that makes sense. It wasn't that awkward silence where you don't know what to say. It was as if he was giving me space to absorb the moment." The audience remained in complete silence, as if any movement or sound might break the spell of the narrative. The show's producers, through Fallon's earpiece, had decided there would be no commercial break, a rare event in network television. The moment transcended the usual market considerations. This was history being made in real time. Jordan took a deep breath, briefly closing his eyes as if to visualize that night in Rome more clearly before continuing. Finally, he spoke. "Michael," the Pope said, his voice soft but clear in the silence of the garden, "perhaps you're wondering why I requested this meeting with so much secrecy." I replied that yes, I was curious. He smiled in that gentle way you see in pictures, but in person, there's a warmth that the cameras never fully capture. "First of all," he continued, "I wanted to meet the man whose journey I've been watching with such interest over the years." I confess I was surprised. The idea of the Pope watching NBA games or following my career seemed surreal. "He must have noticed my surprise," Jordan continued, a slight smile emerging on his lips, because he softly laughed and said, "Yes, even the Pope has interest beyond the scriptures. In Argentina, soccer is my passion, as you know. But your story, Michael, transcends the sport. It's not basketball that fascinates me, but the human resilience you've demonstrated time and time again." His words caught me off guard. I was used to people mentioning the titles, the points, the iconic moments, but he wasn't interested in any of that. "What did he mean by resilience?" Fallon asked, picking up the key term that resonated with the public narrative of Jordan, but clearly sensing that there was a deeper layer being revealed. "That's exactly what I asked him," Jordan replied, his eyes now fully focused on the memory. And his response, well, it was as if he had observed my life through a completely different lens than the one the world uses. He began talking about specific moments in my career that surprisingly he knew in detail. Not just the big games or achievements, but the moments of struggle, the failures, the losses. Jordan paused as if weighing how much of the intimate details of that conversation he should share. The studio remained in complete silence, everyone present aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Michael Jordan, known for his competitive intensity and unshakable composure, allowing a vulnerable glimpse of the man behind the legend. When he resumed speaking, his voice carried a reflective quality that few had ever heard before. "I watched when you were cut from the high school basketball team," Pope Francis said. "I read about how you cried alone afterward and how you turned that rejection into fuel to become better. I saw when the press questioned if you could win a championship, claiming you were just a selfish scorer. I followed your determination when you came back after your first retirement and had to prove your worth again. He knew details that even many dedicated basketball fans didn't know. But then he mentioned something that truly struck me deeply. Michael, he continued, his voice now softer, the moment that most moved me in your journey was how you handled the loss of your father. That paralyzed me. As you know, my father, James Jordan, was murdered in 1993, an event that completely changed my life and led to my first retirement from basketball. It's something I still carry with me every day, even after all these years. The mention of James Jordan caused a nearly palpable ripple of empathy in the studio. Fallon, usually talkative, remained in respectful silence, instinctively understanding that this was sacred territory in his guest's life. The cameras captured a rare moment of contained emotion on Jordan's face. Not tears, but a vulnerability that the public rarely associated with the relentless competitor who had dominated the courts for 2 decades. Then Pope Francis said something I will never forget, Jordan continued, his voice now firmer as he overcame the momentary emotion. When your father was taken from you so cruelly, you carried that pain publicly with extraordinary dignity. And then, when you returned to the court, you transformed that loss into a renewed purpose. You won the championship on Father's Day in 1996 and showed the world a face of pain that many men, especially men in your position and culture, feel compelled to hide. That moment of sincere human vulnerability meant more to countless people than all your points and championships combined. Wow, murmured Fallon, the word escaping involuntarily as he, along with the audience, visualized the famous image of Jordan kneeling on the locker room floor after that iconic win, holding the basketball and crying openly, releasing years of suppressed pain from the loss of his father, who never witnessed his greatest triumphs in the NBA. Exactly, Jimmy. Wow sums it up well, Jordan agreed with a brief nod, because in that moment, I realized I wasn't just talking to the leader of the Catholic Church. I was sitting with a man who deeply understood the human condition, the pain, the growth, the internal struggle we all face, regardless of our fame or wealth. That's when our conversation took an unexpected turn, Jordan continued, adjusting slightly in his seat as if preparing to reveal the true core of the meeting. Pope Francis placed his hand on my shoulder, a simple gesture, but profoundly human, and said, Michael, you possess something far more valuable than any athletic talent God has given you. You have the ability to inspire hope. When people see your journey, they don't just see victories. They see someone who faced real adversities and emerged stronger. They see someone who fell and got up repeatedly. That's what the world needs most today. Not just icons of success, but examples of human perseverance. His words resonated with me in a way few things in my life after basketball had. I spent decades being a symbol of excellence, of dominance, of athletic perfection. The commercials, the movies, the endorsements, all built around this image of infallibility. Be like Mike. But Pope Francis was saying something deeply different, that my greatest value wasn't in perfection, but in the moments of imperfection, vulnerability, and recovery. That's what truly inspired people. Jordan paused, his eyes momentarily drifting toward the audience, as if he was truly seeing their individual faces for the first time since he started his story. The human connection in that studio was palpable, everyone present united by this rare moment of authenticity from one of the most iconic, yet also most reserved figures in contemporary culture. Fallon, recognizing the importance of the moment, remained respectfully silent, allowing Jordan to continue at his own pace. After that moment, our conversation shifted. The Pope stood up and slowly walked around the small fountain in the center of the garden, inviting me to follow him. There is something that deeply concerns me, Michael, he said, his voice now carrying a different weight. Something that keeps this old man awake many nights. That's when I realized we were approaching the true purpose of this extraordinary meeting. Pope Francis began speaking about children in conflict zones around the world, not in an abstract or statistical way, but with direct and personal knowledge that clearly affected him emotionally. He described visits he had made to refugee camps, makeshift hospitals in war zones, schools destroyed by bombs. He spoke about looking into the eyes of children who had lost everything, parents, homes, security, childhood, and how those looks haunted him. In these children, Michael, he said with an intensity that contrasted with his usual gentle manner, I see the future of humanity hanging in a fragile balance. Children who grow up in the midst of violence without education, without hope. What future can we expect? And yet, I've also seen how a simple spark of hope can transform those same eyes. How the smallest positive intervention can completely change the trajectory of these young lives. Jordan's eyes shone with renewed intensity as he recounted this part of the conversation. The audience and Fallon were completely absorbed, the studio suspended in a moment of collective connection that rarely occurs in modern television, often fragmented and distracted. Jordan was now speaking with a conviction that echoed his intensity on the court, but directed towards something far beyond sports. What really struck me was when he shared a personal frustration. As Pope, he told me, I have the platform to speak about these issues, to raise global awareness. But there are severe limits to what I can do directly. There are regions of the world where representatives of the church are not welcome for political or religious reasons. There are places where my position, paradoxically, closes doors instead of opening them. He stopped in front of a small rose bush in the garden, gently touching one of the flowers. Even with all the influence of this position, there are children I cannot reach, young lives that remain beyond my reach. It was a revelatory moment for me, Jimmy, Jordan continued, addressing Fallon directly now, but truly speaking to the millions of viewers. I realized I was witnessing something rare, not just the Pope as a spiritual leader, but as a man dealing with the limitations of his role, with the frustration of knowing what needs to be done, but encountering institutional and geopolitical barriers in the way. It was something I could relate to on a different scale. When you reach a certain level of fame or position, people assume you can do anything, move mountains, but the reality is far more complicated. He seemed genuinely distressed, Jordan reflected, his voice softening. Here was one of the most powerful and respected men on the planet, and yet he felt powerless to help some of the most vulnerable people in the world. There are areas, he explained to me, where any association with the Catholic Church or the Vatican immediately closes doors. Places where decades or centuries of religious conflict have made it impossible for representatives of any organized faith to operate effectively. And yet, it is often these places where children suffer the most, where the need is most desperate. And then, Jimmy, he looked directly at me with those eyes that seemed to see through all the layers of pretense and public image, straight to the core of a person. That's why I asked to meet with you, Michael, he said, because you can reach places I cannot. Your influence transcends political, religious, and cultural borders. In every corner of the world, regardless of creed or ideology, the name and image of Michael Jordan opened doors that remain closed even to faith. Jordan paused, allowing the full weight of those words to settle in the studio. The revelation seemed suspended in the air, subtly altering the atmosphere. Jimmy Fallon, whose usually expressive face had remained in a concentrated state of attention throughout the story, finally spoke, his voice carrying a seriousness rarely seen on his show. He wanted you to do something he couldn't do, Fallon said. Not as a question, but as an understanding beginning to take shape. He saw in you not just a celebrity, but a potential ambassador who could transcend the barriers he faced. Exactly, Jordan confirmed with a solemn nod. And it was at that moment that I fully understood the purpose of that extraordinary meeting. It wasn't just a conversation between two public figures. It was the beginning of a mission that would change my life in ways I could never have imagined. The silence in the studio lingered, dense and meaningful, as Jordan allowed his last words to be absorbed. The cameras had settled into a slower rhythm of cuts, as if the show itself had adapted its pace to the gravity of the story. Jimmy Fallon, recognizing that he was witnessing a historic television moment, maintained an attentive but restrained posture, allowing his guest to lead the narrative at his own pace. After expressing his frustration with the limitations of his position, Jordan continued, his eyes briefly closing, as if to better visualize the scene, Pope Francis walked over to a small stone table in the corner of the garden. It was a simple table worn by time, with a few dry leaves resting on its surface, as if it were rarely disturbed. On it were only two objects, a small wooden cross, very similar to this one. Jordan raised the cross he had taken from the studio table, and a formal-looking envelope sealed with the papal emblem. He picked up the cross first, holding it against the soft light of the lanterns in the garden, examining it with a contemplative expression. This cross, the Pope explained, was carved from the wood of an olive tree in Bethlehem. It isn't valuable in monetary terms, but it carries a deep symbolic meaning. The olive tree represents peace, persistence, and hope. It continues to bear fruit even in barren lands, even after centuries of existence. He then placed the cross in my hands, closing my fingers around it with a gentle but firm gesture. Like this tree, Michael, you have the ability to bring hope to seemingly infertile lands. Believe it or not, Jimmy, Jordan said, addressing Fallon with a slight smile. My hands were trembling at that moment. I, who had made game-winning shots with millions watching and billions of dollars on the line, was nervous holding a simple wooden cross given by the Pope. There was something in the way he looked at me, an expectation, a silent trust that weighed more than any pressure I ever felt on the court. I can believe that, Fallon replied softly, his eyes fixed on Jordan's. All pretense of the talk show host momentarily abandoned. There are certain moments that transcend everything we've experienced before, no matter how extraordinary our lives may have been. Jordan nodded in acknowledgement before continuing. The Pope then picked up the sealed envelope from the table and held it for a moment, as if pondering its weight, not physical, but symbolic. Inside this envelope, he said, is a letter I personally wrote to you, Michael. It contains details of what I'm going to ask of you now, and specific instructions I would like you to follow. But there is a special condition. I ask that you do not open this envelope until you hear the news of my passing. I confess I was shocked by that request. It was as if he was aware of his own mortality in a way that most of us avoid contemplating. Your Holiness, I replied, genuinely concerned. I hope that day is very far away. He laughed softly, that kind of laugh that conveys wisdom and acceptance, not humor. We all have our appointed time, Michael, he said. I do not fear mine, but there is work that must continue even after I leave this world. The camera captured the solemn expression on Jordan's face as he relived that moment, his face reflecting a mixture of reverence and responsibility. The audience remained absolutely silent, each person present completely absorbed in the story. Even the technicians and producers, normally busy with their headsets and monitors, were still paying attention to every word. Jordan took a deep breath before continuing, clearly approaching the heart of the revelation. It was then that he finally verbalized the request that would change the course of my next years. Michael, Pope Francis said, his voice now carrying the weight of formal authority, no longer the casual conversation of before. I am asking you to use your global influence to create a network of support for children in war zones and areas of extreme conflict around the world. Not a conventional charity project or a foundation with your name on it, but something much more discreet and targeted. He walked slowly around the fountain again, as if the gentle movement helped him organize his thoughts. Children in war zones do not just need emergency food and shelter, which many NGOs already admirably provide. They need a sustainable infrastructure of hope, schools that remain open even under bombings, medical facilities that do not close when the media spotlight shifts, mentors who stay when the news cameras leave. His passion was palpable, Jimmy. This was not just a project for him, it was a mission that clearly consumed him. I was deeply moved, but also confused, admitted Jordan, his fingers still playing with the cross. There are countless organizations dedicated to these causes, many with resources far greater than anything I could personally gather. I expressed this doubt to the Pope. Your Holiness, there are entire global organizations dedicated to this work. What can a former basketball player do that they can't? His response? Jordan paused, as if still processing the impact of those words years later. His answer was direct and transformative. These organizations, no matter how noble, face the same obstacles as the Church. They carry flags, national, religious, ideological, that prevent them from entering certain conflict zones. But you, Michael, you carry only your own story. Your fame opens doors that are closed even to faith. In regions where religious representatives are viewed with suspicion, where Western organizations are rejected for political reasons, the name Michael Jordan still evokes universal admiration and respect. The magnitude of what he was proposing began to sink in. It wasn't just a financial contribution or a symbolic endorsement he was asking for. It was a personal commitment, a mission that would require my direct involvement. I'm not asking you to simply donate money or lend your name to a cause, the Pope continued, almost as if reading my thoughts. I'm asking you to build something unique, a global network of influential individuals who can, discreetly, create opportunities for children where others can't. People who, like you, transcend political and cultural borders. The audience of the show was collectively leaning forward in their seats, fully absorbed. Fallon had completely abandoned his usual host persona, his face reflecting the intensity of the story. Jordan continued, his voice now carrying a powerful conviction. Then came the most extraordinary condition of the request, Jordan said, looking directly into the main camera, as if speaking directly to the millions of viewers. Pope Francis emphasized, this mission must remain completely secret until the time I designate, after my death. No cameras, no publicity, no press releases, no mention of the church's name. True acts of service are those done without public recognition. He explained that any public association with me or the church could compromise access to exactly the regions where the need is most critical. I remember asking him why the secrecy should end with his death. His answer was deeply moving, because at that moment, the story will no longer be about a pope asking something of a celebrity. It will be about a human commitment that transcends institutions and borders. And the world will need to hear this story then, as a testimony that true change often starts in the shadows, far from the spotlight. For someone like me, Jimmy, Jordan said, turning to Fallon with a contemplative expression, who lived much of adult life under constant scrutiny, the idea of doing meaningful work completely away from the public eye was almost liberating. Throughout my career, every move, every decision, every word was analyzed and judged. The Pope was essentially asking me to use that same fame, but in a completely different way, discreetly, silently, letting the results, not the recognition, be the true reward. Fallon nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. It's almost the complete opposite of today's social media culture, where it often seems that a charitable act only counts if it's documented and shared online, he remarked, his voice noticeably more reflective than his usual tone. Exactly, Jordan agreed, and that was precisely the Pope's intention. He specifically talked about this, how our modern culture of celebrity and constant self-promotion often compromises the work of genuine humanitarian aid. The most vulnerable communities in the world don't need saviors who arrive with cameras and corporate logos, he said. They need true partners who are willing to work in the shadows, building foundations instead of monuments. The conversation continued for almost 2 hours that evening in the garden. Jordan continued, his expression indicating that he was omitting many personal details of the exchange. Pope Francis spoke with surprisingly detailed knowledge about specific conflict areas, South Sudan, Yemen, parts of Syria, and regions of the Sahel in Africa, places where children face some of the most desperate circumstances imaginable. He described schools operating in basements during bombings, doctors performing surgeries by candlelight, teachers risking their lives daily just to give children a few hours of normalcy. These people, he said, are the true heroes of our time. They don't need us to take over their work. They need us to remove the obstacles they face, resources blocked by international sanctions, medical supplies prevented from entering certain regions, funds frozen by transnational banking disputes. These are precisely the barriers that someone with your global influence could help overcome, while official organizations often remain powerless. The intensity on Jordan's face grew as he continued, as if he were reliving not only the conversation with the Pope, but also the experiences he had clearly had as a result of that encounter. His eyes, always intense, seemed to look through the camera to something far away, the children and places he had apparently visited in the years since. Before I left that night, the Pope made one last remark that stayed with me. He pointed to the wooden cross that was now in my pocket. This symbol, he said, does not only represent religious faith, but something more universal, the human ability to endure suffering and still hold on to hope. Carrying this cross does not mean that you carry my institution or my specific theology. It means that you recognize that our highest purpose in life is to relieve the suffering of others without seeking recognition for it. As we said goodbye in the garden, Pope Francis held my hand for a moment. "Michael," he said, looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that I vividly remember to this day, "your fame opens doors that are closed even to faith. Use this extraordinary gift not just for products or entertainment, but to create spaces of hope where they seem impossible." Those words, they changed something fundamental in me, Jimmy. They redefined the purpose of fame in a way I had never considered before. I left the Vatican that night through the same discreet entrance, carrying the wooden cross and the sealed envelope. The Monsignor who accompanied me to the car didn't say a word, just a respectful nod as if recognizing the magnitude of what had just occurred. As the car drove through the streets of Rome towards my hotel, I observed the carefree tourists, the locals dining at outdoor restaurants, life continuing unaware of the extraordinary meeting that had just taken place. I touched the cross in my pocket, feeling its weight, not physical but symbolic, and I knew my life had changed irrevocably. Fallon, having remained quietly attentive during this long section of the story, finally spoke, his voice soft but clear in the silence of the studio. "And you accepted the mission," he said, not as a question, but as an obvious statement based on the fact that Jordan was revealing the story now. Jordan looked at the cross in his hand, then at the silent studio, and finally directly at the main camera. When he spoke, his voice carried the same determination that basketball fans had witnessed when he faced the most decisive moments of his sports career. "Yes, Jimmy," he simply replied. "I accepted, and the last 3 years of my life have been dedicated to fulfilling the promise I made that night in the Vatican garden, a promise that, until this moment, I have kept completely secret, as requested." The lights, which usually pulsed with the effervescent energy typical of late-night talk shows, seemed to have softened on their own, creating an almost reverential atmosphere. Jimmy Fallon, visibly moved, took a few seconds to compose himself before articulating the question that millions of viewers were undoubtedly asking themselves. "Michael," he began, his voice deeper than usual, "you've just revealed something extraordinary, a secret request from Pope Francis that you've kept absolutely confidential for 3 years. If I understood correctly, you're sharing this now because he passed away last week," Jordan completed softly, emotion contained in his voice. "As per his wishes that night in the Vatican, this was the moment designated for the world to know. Not during his life, when the story could be about him or about me, but now, when it can be about the work that has been done, and more importantly, about the children who have been helped." "I imagined," Fallon nodded respectfully. "And during these 3 years, you've truly been secretly involved in this mission? No media coverage, no public announcements?" "Absolutely none," Jordan confirmed, his gaze intensifying. "And that wasn't easy in today's hyper-connected world. My security team and some close advisors had to create elaborate cover stories for my absences. Supposed vacations at private properties, fictitious business meetings, even strategically planted rumors of health issues I preferred to keep private, all so that I could disappear for weeks without raising significant suspicion." Jordan gestured to one of the producers backstage, who quickly approached with a tablet. He handled it for a few seconds before handing it to Fallon, whose eyes widened noticeably upon seeing the content on the screen. The camera captured the exact moment when the host placed his hand over his mouth in an involuntary gesture of astonishment. The viewers at home couldn't see what was being shown, heightening the anticipation that permeated every aspect of this unprecedented television moment. "My God, Michael," Fallon murmured, raising his eyes from the screen with genuine admiration. Can I show this to the public? Do we have permission to broadcast these images?" "We do now," Jordan replied with a slight nod. "Part of the reason I chose your show for this revelation was the agreement we made in advance with your production team. This is the first time these images will be seen by anyone outside the small circle directly involved in the project. As you can see, we've kept everything meticulously documented, not for publicity, but for accountability. With a gesture from Fallon, the program's technical director initiated a sequence of images that now filled the screens of the millions of viewers tuned in. The first showed Michael Jordan, dressed simply and discreetly, khaki pants, a blue button-down shirt, and a baseball cap pulled over his eyes, disembarking from a small, unidentified plane on a dirt runway. The location was not immediately recognizable to most viewers, but the discreet caption in the lower right corner identified South Sudan, June 2022. The contrast between the global basketball icon and the austere surroundings was striking. There was no entourage, no logos or cameras, just Jordan and two unidentified men carrying simple backpacks. "This was my first operational trip," Jordan explained as the image filled the screens. "3 months after my meeting with Pope Francis. That region was facing not only armed conflict but also a devastating famine crisis. Traditional humanitarian organizations were having trouble accessing certain areas due to blockades imposed by local factions. What the public doesn't know is how much sports, especially basketball, have become popular in parts of Africa like this. My presence opened doors that had been closed to aid agencies for months. We didn't announce that I was coming. There were no press releases, no diplomatic entourage. It was just me and two humanitarian logistics experts who had worked with Doctors Without Borders before. We arrived as private citizens, theoretically as part of a sports education initiative. The plan was simple in theory, but incredibly complex in execution, to use my identity as an athlete to gain access and trust, and then direct resources to the most critical needs we identified. The images continued to appear on the screens. Jordan sitting on the floor of an improvised school in a tent, surrounded by wide-eyed children, clearly malnourished but smiling. Jordan intensely talking to local leaders in a simple brick building. Jordan helping to unload medical supplies from a truck under the scorching sun. Each image told its own story of direct engagement, without the usual trappings of celebrity appearances in crisis zones. No corporate logos, no press entourages, no polished aesthetics of conventional charity campaigns. When you remove the performative aspects of humanitarian aid, Jordan continued as the images continued, when you're not concerned with how the photos will look in press releases or how much media coverage you can get, something remarkable happens. The barriers come down. People start to see you not as a celebrity or a symbol, but as a genuinely present and engaged human being. It's hard to describe what those first few weeks meant to me, Jimmy. I, who had spent decades being treated as something more than human, an idol, a product, a brand, suddenly was just a man working side by side with extraordinary people in impossible circumstances. Local doctors performing surgeries with minimal resources, teachers keeping schools running in active combat zones, mothers creating spaces of normalcy for their children amidst absolute chaos. They asked me, "Why are you here? Where are the cameras? What organization do you represent?" And when I answered, "I'm here just as myself, no cameras, no organization," something changed in their eyes. The images on the screen changed to a building under construction, newly erected concrete walls contrasting with the barren landscape around. Local workers and some expatriates could be seen installing basic medical equipment, while children curiously watched through windows still without glass. The caption identified Pediatric Clinic, Darfur Region, September 2022. "This was our first infrastructure project," Jordan explained, an evident pride in his usually reserved voice. A clinic specialized in pediatric care in a region that had lost all its medical facilities during years of conflict. "We built it in a modular way, designed to be easily repaired if damaged, with independent solar power systems in its own artesian well. Most importantly, we trained local medical teams simultaneously, ensuring that the clinic wouldn't rely on expatriate staff to operate." What we didn't show in these images was the intense diplomatic work happening behind the scenes. We used my access to leaders of conflicting factions to negotiate a neutral zone around the clinic, an agreement that, regardless of the battles occurring around it, that space would remain inviolate, a sanctuary for children of all ethnicities and affiliations. It was the kind of deal that formal organizations rarely manage to secure, precisely because they don't carry institutional flags. "How did you manage to fund all of this without raising suspicions?" Fallon asked, voicing the question that many viewers were surely asking themselves. Projects like this surely require significant resources. That was one of the most challenging parts of the mission, Jordan admitted, a slight smile forming on his lips, and where the true genius of Pope Francis's plan revealed itself. He understood something fundamental about the contemporary world, that while institutions are easily blocked by politics and prejudices, individuals with global influence can operate through completely different channels. The sequence of images on the screen changed dramatically, revealing Jordan in surprisingly diverse environments. On an improvised basketball court, playing with children in worn school uniforms, at a table with what appeared to be local businessmen in a modern urban setting, in an elegant conference room with several faces that many viewers would recognize instantly, although none were identified by name. The pattern was clear. Jordan seemed to be building a network that transcended conventional humanitarian aid channels. I quickly realized that to create sustainable impact, I would need more than just my own resources and influence. I would need to build a discrete coalition of people whose influence collectively could bypass virtually any political or institutional barrier. So I started recruiting, very carefully, very discreetly, using personal connections developed over decades. The recruitment process was meticulous, Jordan continued, his tone reflecting the seriousness of the operation. Each person was approached individually, always in face-to-face conversations, never by phone or email. I explained Pope Francis's request, showed evidence of the initial work, and made clear the fundamental requirement: absolute confidentiality, no public recognition, no mention in tax reports or authorized biographies. It was a test of character as much as a request for assistance. Surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, the response was extraordinary. Elite athletes like myself, who understood the weight of public expectation, tech executives with the resources to mobilize innovative solutions, artists whose cultural influence transcended political borders, even political figures operating strictly in a personal capacity. We created a parallel network of influence and resources that didn't appear in any official organizational chart, had no headquarters or website, and issued no press releases. The images continued to flow. A modern hospital rising in what appeared to be a war-damaged urban area, a school with solar panels on the roof surrounded by a high wall, a community center where teenagers learned technical skills on computers, a sports field amidst a partially rebuilt, devastated landscape. The contrast between the new infrastructure and the war-torn surroundings was visually striking. In the last 3 years, Jordan explained, his voice now carrying a palpable emotional weight, this network has built or rebuilt 17 schools, 9 medical clinics specializing in pediatric care, 5 vocational training centers for teenagers, and countless recreational spaces. More important than the physical infrastructure, we've established sustainable support systems, international scholarships for advanced medical training, mentoring programs connecting promising youth to global opportunities, localized ceasefire agreements around educational institutions. The most innovative element, which was only possible due to the non-institutional nature of our work, was the creation of what we call digital gates, satellite internet connections independent of local infrastructure, allowing schools and clinics in conflict zones to connect directly to educational resources and global medical expertise, bypassing physical and political restrictions. Children who had never left war-torn villages could suddenly take online classes taught by professors at elite universities or receive medical diagnoses from specialists thousands of miles away. Fallon, visibly moved, tried to articulate a response, but seemed momentarily speechless, a rarity for the loquacious host. The images continued to flow on the screens, each telling its own story of transformation in impossible circumstances. Finally, he managed to ask, "How did you manage to keep all of this a secret for so long?" "There must have been moments when it was tempting to share the impact you were having." "There were moments of temptation, no doubt," Jordan admitted, a melancholic smile crossing his face, "especially when we saw tangible results. The first graduating class from a school we had rebuilt. Children recovering from diseases that would have been fatal without the clinics we set up. But my commitment to Pope Francis was sacred to me, and there was a profound wisdom in his request for secrecy. He understood something that I have found to be absolutely true. The moment this work became public, it would instantly be categorized, politicized, and potentially compromised. Regions that granted us access because we were individuals without institutional flags might suddenly see us as agents of Western or religious interests. Anonymity was our greatest protection and our most valuable access. The images on the screen now showed more personal and emotional scenes. Jordan sitting in a circle with children in what appeared to be an improvised library, reading a book. Jordan carrying a small child into a clinic, his face marked by genuine concern. Jordan in an intense conversation with an older man whose attire suggested he might be a local tribal or religious leader. These last images are from my most recent visit, 2 months ago, to a region that I prefer not to publicly identify, as the work there remains extremely sensitive, Jordan explained. It was during this trip that I received the news of Pope Francis's deteriorating health. I vividly remember the moment. I was helping distribute school supplies in a school we had rebuilt after a bombing when my secure contact discreetly informed me. I felt such a wave of emotion that I had to step away for a few minutes. That night, alone in my simple accommodation, I reflected on the extraordinary journey I had started 3 years earlier in that Vatican garden. How a singular request had expanded into a global network of impact. How lives were silently being transformed, far from the spotlight. I stayed up late, mentally reviewing every project, every child, every small victory against impossible odds. When I finally fell asleep, I had such a vivid dream that upon waking, I had to question if it had been just a product of my subconscious. The entire studio seemed to collectively hold its breath. Jordan rarely spoke publicly about personal experiences of this nature, and the vulnerability in his voice was palpable. Even Fallon, known for his enthusiastic interjections, remained in respectful silence, allowing the narrative to flow uninterrupted. In the dream, Jordan continued, his voice noticeably softer, I found myself on an outdoor basketball court that I didn't initially recognize. The sky above was an impossible shade of blue, and the court was surrounded by lush trees that seemed to belong to no specific ecosystem I knew. Then I realized the court combined elements from all the places we had worked in the last few years. The simple concrete floor like the one we built in a refugee camp in the Sahel, the backboards made from recycled materials like the ones we installed in a school in Syria, the hand-painted boundary lines like those in a village in South Sudan. The court was filled with children, dozens of them of all ages, ethnicities, and nationalities imaginable. Some I recognized instantly from our missions. Others seemed to represent all the children who still needed help. They were playing together in harmony that transcended language and cultural barriers, laughing and calling to each other in a cacophony of different languages that, in the dream, I understood perfectly. Suddenly I realized I was not alone watching the scene. Beside me, dressed in his simple white cassock, was Pope Francis, looking exactly as he did that night in the Vatican garden. He was watching the children with a serene expression of joy that conveyed both contentment and a deep peace. They are wonderful, aren't they? He said, not taking his eyes off the children. Each one of them carries the future within them, not just their individual futures, but the future of humanity. Every mind nurtured instead of traumatized, every heart encouraged instead of hardened by pain, every spirit lifted instead of crushed by circumstance. These are the true treasures we are building. We watched together for a while, and then, without words really being necessary, I understood that he was saying goodbye. Before turning to leave, he placed his hand on my shoulder, exactly as he had done that night in the Vatican, and said with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room around us, You have built bridges where others have erected walls, Michael. This is the true championship you've won. The silence in the studio was absolute as Jordan finished recounting his dream. No one moved. Neither the technicians in the back, nor the audience, nor even Fallon, who seemed momentarily incapable of resuming his professional role. Jordan's vulnerability and sincerity had created a moment of human connection rarely experienced on national television. The next morning, Jordan finally continued, his voice regaining some of its characteristic firmness, I received the news that Pope Francis had passed away during the night. The coincidence of the timing with my dream was, Well, each person can interpret it in their own way. What I know for sure is that, at that moment, I felt an even greater responsibility to honor the commitment I had made. And part of that commitment was to publicly reveal this mission after his death, exactly as he had asked. That's why I'm here today, Jimmy. Not just to tell an extraordinary story about a secret meeting with the Pope, but to inaugurate the next chapter of this work. Because while the original request was to keep everything confidential during Pope Francis's life, his instructions for the period after his death were equally clear: to turn this discreet effort into a larger global movement, to inspire others to build bridges where there are currently only walls. Fallon, finally regaining his composure, asked what millions of viewers were certainly wondering. And what happens now, Michael? Doesn't this public revelation jeopardize the very projects you've described? It's a valid concern, Jordan nodded, and one we have carefully considered. The specific projects we've already established will continue operating under the same principle of discretion. I won't be identifying specific locations or individuals involved. What we are making public is the model, not the operational details. And this model, of transcultural influence directed toward areas of greatest need, without the restrictions of institutional flags, has the potential to replicate far beyond what any individual network could achieve. In a very real sense, Jimmy, this revelation is not the end of a secret mission, but the beginning of a much larger movement. The sealed envelope Pope Francis gave me, which I only opened after receiving the news of his passing, contained not only personal reflections, but a detailed plan for this next phase. A plan he evidently developed knowing he would not live to see its full realization, but trusting that the work would continue. As Jordan spoke, the images on the screen shifted to show a simple, elegant logo, a stylized bridge connecting two shores with small figures representing children walking across it. Below, in clear typography, the words read, "Bridges of Hope, Rebuilding Futures Beyond Borders." "This is the next phase," Jordan explained, a new sense of purpose evident in his voice. "A foundation that will operate with complete transparency but maintain the fundamental principles that guided our secret work. Direct intervention where it is most needed, without the constraints of political or religious affiliations, focused exclusively on the needs of children in conflict zones." What you are seeing today, Jimmy, is not just the revelation of a secret kept for 3 years. It is the fulfillment of a promise made to an extraordinary man who saw possibilities where others saw only insurmountable barriers. And, more importantly, it is an invitation for others to join this work, not as followers, but as builders of their own bridges. The Tonight Show studio had transcended its usual function of entertainment, transforming into a nearly solemn space, like a small secular chapel where a story of profound human meaning was unfolding. The lights, softer than usual, created an intimate atmosphere rarely experienced on network television. Jimmy Fallon, visibly moved, alternated his gaze between Jordan and the Bridges of Hope logo still filling the screens around the studio. The audience remained in reverent silence, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing not just a talk show segment, but a genuine historic moment. The revelation of a secret mission that had operated in the shadows for 3 years, silently impacting some of the world's most vulnerable children. "Michael," Fallon said finally, his tone devoid of the usual joviality, "you mentioned the sealed envelope that Pope Francis gave you that night in the Vatican, the one you were only supposed to open after his death. You said you opened it recently. May I ask what was inside?" Jordan looked at the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope, visibly aged, with the papal seal partially broken. He held it with palpable reverence, as if it were something infinitely more valuable than its simple appearance suggested. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as though contemplating whether he should really share something so deeply personal with millions of viewers. His eyes, always intense, seemed to be evaluating a momentary decision. "I didn't plan to do this when I came on the show tonight," he admitted, weighing the envelope in his hands. "I thought I would share the concept, the mission, the results, but not necessarily the exact words he wrote to me. It's something I've kept extremely private since I opened this envelope last week after receiving the news of his passing. But perhaps this is exactly the right moment. And this." the right place. "Are you sure?" asked Fallon, with genuine concern. "Something like this is deeply personal. No one would expect you to share." Pope Francis chose his words knowing that eventually they might become public, Jordan interrupted softly. He was a man who weighed every word, every gesture, and more importantly, he specifically instructed me to make this mission public after his death. I think he would understand, perhaps even expect, that his own words would become part of this revelation. With renewed determination, Jordan carefully opened the envelope, avoiding damaging the partially broken seal, and withdrew several sheets of paper, handwritten in elegant but slightly trembling script. The moment carried an almost sacramental weight, heightened by the absolute silence that permeated the studio. When he began to read, his voice took on a quality few had ever witnessed before, softer, more vulnerable, as if the mere act of verbalizing the words connected him directly to the man who had written them. "My dear Michael," he began, "if you are reading these words, it means I have completed my earthly journey and returned to the Father's house. Do not fear for me. I depart in peace, grateful for the life I was given and for the extraordinary souls like yours that I had the privilege of encountering along the way. Our evening of conversation in the Vatican garden remains to me one of the most meaningful encounters of my years as Pope, not for your fame or athletic accomplishments, but for the genuine humanity I discovered behind the public legend." Jordan paused briefly, clearly moved, before continuing. "When you read these words, 3 years will have passed since our meeting, 3 years during which you have operated in the shadows, building bridges of hope where others have raised only walls of division and mistrust. I know this for certain, not because I can predict the future, but because I recognized in you, during our brief encounter, something I rarely find in people of your position and influence: a genuine willingness to serve without recognition, to use your extraordinary privilege not as a shield that separates you from human suffering, but as a tool to alleviate it." "His words," Jordan murmured, briefly interrupting his reading. It's as if he knew exactly what would happen in the following years. Not in specific details, but the essence, the direction. It's almost prophetic. "Perhaps he simply knew the human heart well," Fallon suggested gently, "and especially yours." Jordan nodded slightly before returning to the letter. "Now the time has come that we discussed that night. The time to transform silent work into a public testimony, not for personal glorification, but to inspire others to recognize their own potential, to transcend the barriers that divide our global human family. You have found, I am sure, that there is an extraordinary freedom in serving without the constraints of fame or recognition, in being simply Michael, the man, not Michael Jordan, the icon. And yet, paradoxically, it is precisely your public identity that must now be used to amplify this work." The camera captured the audience, many with unrestrained tears streaming down their faces, completely absorbed in the words of the late pontiff. The moment had transcended entertainment, becoming something closer to a spiritual testimony shared collectively through the television waves to millions of homes. Even the technicians and producers, people who lived in a world of professional cynicism, were visibly moved. "I include in this letter," Jordan continued, turning to the second page, "the plans for what should become the Bridges of Hope Foundation. This name was not chosen lightly. It represents the essence of what we began together. Bridges, not walls. Connections, not divisions. Hope, not despair. The structural and legal details have been prepared by trusted advisors here at the Vatican, who will remain available to assist you in the transition from secret work to a public presence that will, however, maintain the integrity of the original approach. An essential feature of this transition will be the recognition of those who have joined you in these years of silent work. Exceptional people who, like you, chose to serve without recognition, who dedicated resources, influence, and, most importantly, genuine personal presence to children whom the world often forgets. The time has come for these secret bridge builders to be recognized, not for personal glorification, but as a testimony that even in our often divided and polarized world, there are still those willing to transcend differences for a greater good. Jordan looked at the screens around the studio, which now displayed once again some of the images shown earlier. This time, however, the focus shifted. The camera zoomed in on faces that had previously remained in the background, figures whose presence had not been emphasized in the first display. With growing surprise, the audience and viewers began to recognize familiar faces. Legendary athletes, globally known artists, billionaire entrepreneurs, all working discreetly under austere conditions, without publicity, without logos, without entourages. As Pope Francis predicted in his letter, Jordan explained, indicating the images, the time has come to recognize those who have joined this mission silently over the last 3 years. You probably recognize some of these faces, though we have been extremely careful to keep them in the background in all visual documentation until now. Every person you see in these images, and many others who were not photographed, committed to the same pact of secrecy and direct service that I made that night in the Vatican. The images continued to flow, a global football superstar helping to build a school in the Middle East, a renowned Hollywood actor teaching a theater workshop for refugee children, a tech CEO installing medical equipment in an improvised clinic, a tennis legend organizing a sports program in a war-torn field. No names were explicitly mentioned, but the faces were unmistakable to anyone even vaguely familiar with contemporary global culture. What you're seeing is not just a collection of celebrities doing charity, Jordan continued, his voice carrying an intensified passion. It's a network of individuals who dedicated weeks, sometimes months, of direct personal presence in some of the most dangerous and underprivileged regions of the world, without photographers, without press releases, without any registered tax benefits. Each of them sacrificed comfort, security, and what celebrities value the most, private time away from public obligations, to be physically present where the need was most desperate. There were moments of real danger, Jordan admitted, his gaze momentarily distant, as if reliving specific memories. Active conflict zones don't become safe just because a famous person is present. There were emergency evacuations, serious illnesses contracted in the field, even injuries. There were nights spent in underground shelters during bombings, days without running water or reliable electricity, and yet every person I invited to this mission, without exception, returned for additional missions after experiencing the realities on the ground. Not out of obligation or guilt, but because they found something in the children they were serving that fundamentally transformed their own perspectives. Returning to the letter, Jordan continued reading. The true measure of success for this mission will not be found in buildings constructed or resources distributed, however vital they may be. It will be found in the individual stories of transformation, in the young lives redirected from trauma to hope, from despair to possibility. I ask that you share some of these stories when you make this work public, not as statistics or abstract case studies, but as testimonies of the human ability to thrive even in the most unlikely soils when nourished with dignity and genuine opportunity. Jordan looked back at Fallon and the camera, clearly ready to fulfill this specific request. Among the hundreds of stories we could share, there are a few that perfectly exemplify what Pope Francis was describing. Stories that I personally witnessed, that I followed from the beginning to what is still not the end, but a new beginning. The screens around the studio now displayed new images, no longer operational documentation of projects, but more personal portraits of specific children. The first showed a girl, approximately 12 years old, with intensely serious eyes for her age, sitting in an improvised classroom, absorbed in an advanced science book. The second image showed the same girl, a few months later, teaching mathematical concepts to younger children. This is Amina, Jordan explained, his tone noticeably softening. I met her during our first mission in South Sudan. She had lost all her immediate family in an attack on her village 2 years before. When I found her, she hadn't spoken a single word in over a year, according to the caregivers at the shelter where she lived. During my initial visit, I noticed something extraordinary. While the other children were naturally curious about my presence, Amina kept her distance, flipping through an advanced math book found in a donation box, completely absorbed in problems that were clearly far beyond the material available for her age. Instead of trying to engage her directly, I asked a local teacher to assess her. We discovered that, despite her formal education being interrupted at the age of 9, she had continued learning on her own, devouring any educational material she could find. Her aptitude for math and science was exceptional, literally at a prodigious level. But without structure, mentors, or continued education, this extraordinary potential was doomed to remain unrealized. The next image showed the same girl in a completely different environment, a modern laboratory, working alongside adults in lab coats, her face illuminated by intense concentration as she handled sophisticated scientific equipment. Through our network, we were able to not only establish a personalized educational program for Amina, but eventually, when she was ready, a placement in an elite scientific program in Nairobi with holistic support for all her needs. Not just academic, but emotional and psychological. The trauma she endured didn't magically disappear, but it was addressed with the professional support she deserved, alongside opportunities to develop her extraordinary intellect. Today at 15, Amina not only speaks again, but is developing a simplified water purification system that could potentially be implemented in rural communities with no access to advanced infrastructure. More importantly, she now regularly returns to South Sudan to inspire other girls, proving that even from the most devastating circumstances, transformative futures are possible. The audience reacted with spontaneous applause, but Jordan gently raised his hand, signaling that there was more to share. The screens changed to show a teenager with a prosthetic on his right leg, standing in what appeared to be a rehabilitation center, surrounded by medical equipment. This is Rami, from Syria. When I met him, he was 14 years old and had lost his leg in a bombing 3 years earlier. He had undergone multiple inadequate surgeries, resulting in chronic complications that severely limited his mobility, even with basic prosthetic devices. But what impressed me wasn't his medical condition, but his unwavering determination. Even with constant pain and limited mobility, he voluntarily helped at the local clinic, assisting younger amputees in adapting to their prosthetics. Through our network, we were able to connect him with specialists in advanced prosthetic technology. Not only did we provide him with a custom-made state-of-the-art prosthetic, but we also arranged a series of corrective surgeries performed by some of the best orthopedic trauma specialists in the world, who traveled discreetly to the region specifically for this case. The next image showed the same young man, now visibly older, standing in front of a small group in a simple but organized medical space, seemingly leading some kind of training. Today, Rami is not just a successful patient. He has become a certified prosthetic technician, specializing in helping children and teenagers affected by war trauma. At just 17 years old, he has already trained local medical teams in 5 different provinces, bringing advanced rehabilitation techniques to areas where such knowledge simply didn't exist before. His dream is eventually to become an orthopedic surgeon, and we are currently working to make that possible. The stories of Amina and Rami, Jordan continued, his voice carrying a palpable emotional weight, represent exactly what Pope Francis described as the true purpose of this mission. Not just providing temporary help or momentary relief, but creating sustainable opportunities for exceptional young people to not only overcome their own trauma, but eventually lead the transformation of their own communities. The screens now displayed several simultaneous images, dozens of different children in various contexts, each clearly representing a unique story of transformation. Jordan didn't try to narrate each one individually, allowing the images to speak for themselves as he returned to Pope Francis' letter for its final sections. The Hope Bridges Foundation, he read, must operate with clear principles that differentiate its work from conventional humanitarian approaches. First, the commitment to direct personal presence, not just financial resources sent from afar, but individuals physically present, working side by side with local communities. Second, the absolute respect for local wisdom and leadership, not impose projects from the outside, but genuine partnerships that recognize that those who live a reality every day understand their needs more deeply than any external expert. Third, an unwavering focus on individual potential, seeing each child not as a victim to be rescued, but as a human being with unique talents and abilities waiting to bloom, given the right opportunities. The audience was completely transfixed, many visibly moved. Fallon remained attentively silent, instinctively understanding that this moment transcended the usual interview format. The entire program had been transformed into something beyond entertainment, a testimony, a revelation, a call to action both silent and powerful. The Pope continues with detailed instructions about the organizational structure of the foundation, Jordan explained, quickly flipping through several pages. Legal, financial, operational aspects. He clearly dedicated considerable time and thought to these practical details, working with advisors to ensure that the transition from a secret effort to a public organization would be as smooth as possible. But it's the final paragraph that Jordan paused, visibly emotional, needing a moment to compose himself. He looked at the last page, then at the silent studio, as if hesitating to share these final words, so personal and powerful they seemed. When he finally continued, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than the audience had ever witnessed. Michael, he read, as I conclude this letter, I cannot help but reflect on the apparent improbability of our connection. A senior pontiff from Argentina and an American basketball legend, united by a shared concern for the most vulnerable children in the world. And yet, the more I consider it, the less improbable it seems. For under the labels and titles the world assigns us, there exists a fundamental shared humanity that transcends all superficial differences. This is the essential truth our fractured world most desperately needs to rediscover. When the world sees only differences of religion, nationality, ideology, status, the true champions see the shared humanity. This has always been your greatest gift, Michael, not your extraordinary athletic feats, but your ability to inspire others to overcome limitations and seemingly insurmountable divisions. May this next phase of your journey continue to build bridges where others see only impassable chasms. In faith and hope, Francisco. The silence that followed was deep and complete, a rare moment when an entire television studio, normally vibrant with energy and constant production, seemed collectively breathless. The Pope's final words hung in the air, not just as a personal message to Jordan, but as a larger spiritual testament, a call to shared humanity that transcended religious, political, and cultural divisions. Jordan carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope, his face revealing the deep personal impact that those words continued to have on him. When he looked back at Fallon and the camera, there was a renewed resolve in his expression, not the competitive intensity for which he had become famous on the courts, but something deeper, more serene, and yet equally powerful. From today, he said finally, his voice regaining strength, the Hope Bridges Foundation officially exists as a public entity, continuing and expanding the work that began that night in the Vatican Garden. Our website has been launched simultaneously with this broadcast, detailing both the principles and the practical opportunities for involvement. The network of influential individuals we've gathered over the past 3 years is now expanding, inviting others, not just celebrities and public figures, but ordinary people with skills, resources, or simply the heart to serve, to join this work. We will continue operating with the same fundamental principle that has guided our quiet work, the commitment to genuine personal presence, not just distant financial contributions. Every member of this network, regardless of their public profile, commits to direct field involvement, working side by side with local communities, not as saviors or external experts, but as true partners in building futures for children whose potential the world often overlooks. The legacy of Pope Francis will continue not through monuments or institutions bearing his name, but through this practical, direct, and transformative work, building bridges where others have erected walls, seeing possibilities where others see only despair, recognizing the fundamental shared humanity that connects us across all superficial differences. Fallon, clearly moved, asked one final question, not as a host fulfilling his professional obligations, but as a human being genuinely touched by the extraordinary narrative he had just witnessed. Michael, after everything you've shared with us tonight, what do you hope people take away from this moment? Jordan considered the question for a moment, his eyes briefly drifting to the small wooden cross resting on the table, the object that had inadvertently triggered this entire revelation. When he answered, his voice carried the same serene conviction that had marked his final words on the court years earlier, when he announced his last retirement. I hope people recognize that this is not just a project of Michael Jordan, or an initiative associated with Pope Francis, or even a foundation with a specific mission. It's a testament to the possibility still present in our often divided world. The possibility of transcending the categories and labels that separate us and finding our essential shared humanity. When we do that, when we truly see each other as human beings first, before all the other identities we carry, we discover that we can build bridges where we once saw only insurmountable divisions. Pope Francis, in our conversation that night at the Vatican, shared an observation that has stayed with me all these years. Children, he said, naturally build bridges because they haven't yet learned to believe in the necessity of walls. This foundation exists to protect and nurture that innate ability for human connection, starting with those who most desperately need it, children born into circumstances of conflict and deprivation, but eventually expanding to transform the way all of us see our differences and divisions. This is not a story about a secret meeting between a pope and a basketball player. It is a story about the shared humanity that exists beyond all titles, achievements, and superficial differences. And my deepest hope is that it inspires others to recognize their own unique abilities to build bridges across the divisions they encounter in their own lives and communities. Jordan's final words hung in the studio like a secular blessing, a moment of authentic human connection rarely experienced on modern television. The camera captured Fallon's face, visibly moved, then the audience, many with tears streaming down their faces, and finally returned to Jordan, the man the world had known for decades as the greatest athlete of his generation, but who that night revealed a dimension of purpose and meaning that completely transcended his legendary sports career. Michael Jordan, Fallon concluded softly, abandoning the standard presentation format in favor of a moment of genuine human connection. Thank you not only for sharing this extraordinary story with us tonight, but for living a life that, in its new dimension, reminds us of what is truly possible when we look beyond divisions to our shared humanity. As the show neared its end, the screens displayed the logo of the Hope Bridges Foundation one last time, accompanied by a website and contact information for those inspired to get involved. And beside the logo, almost like a spiritual signature over the entire project, the small wooden cross that had inadvertently triggered this extraordinary revelation. A simple symbol that had connected a pope and a basketball player in a shared mission that now finally emerged from the shadows to inspire a world hungry for examples of genuine humanity transcending seemingly insurmountable divisions. Did you enjoy the story of Michael Jordan and Pope Francis? Then subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and don't miss the next video that's already waiting for you on the screen. See you there. Oh, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you thought of the ending of the story.